2. I said microphone check. 1, 2. Can't nobody out here do it like me. Ain't nobody out here winning like me. Can't nobody out here do it like me. Just like me, like me. Can't nobody out here do it like me. Ain't nobody out here winning like me. Can't nobody out here do it like me. Just like me, like me. Yeah, holy smokes, I'm no joke out the bullpen. Bringing nothing but heat, leave you hanging like clothespins. He's a beast when he goes in, ice cold frozen. The first round draft pick, #1 chosen. Drop bombs, explosion, self-promotion. And I keep shit moving like a flanker in motion. I'm the #1 spokesman, it's my devotion that I'm dedicated to. This is my time, I'm on the rise, can't hold me down, I'm too fly. This is my time, ready to shine, brighter than all of the lights. Cause when it's game time, seconds away and the game's on the line. There ain't no doubt in my mind, beating the buzzer like, this is my time, this is my moment. You better bet that I'm on it, ready and set, I'ma own it. Blast it to 10, then keep going, there ain't no coasting, I never settle, don't play. Putting the kettle to flame, I go 100 all day, foot on the pedal, no break.
Hey everyone, Mike from CannaCribs Consulting and GrowersHouse.com here. Thanks for joining us for the webinar today. Today is going to be about nutrient planning. So we're going to go over some of the most important questions usually asked, or some of the more important questions that are not answered a lot of the times, like what do macros do, what do micros do, what does each micronutrient do. So we're going to go over all of that and more. Be sure to stick around to the end. We're going to have some special offers for you from GrowersHouse.com. So sit tight, thanks for joining, and the webinar will be starting shortly.
I'm Roger Hendricks, at Amazing Cannabis, and we're here to share a pro tip of the day. Danny is our lead grower. He's going to help us prepare a transplant sauce. Alrighty guys, so let's get started. You want to start with about 40 gallons of reverse osmosis water. Ours is ozonated, so we're going to have a little bit higher content of dissolved oxygen. When you're mixing your organic sauce, you want to start with the silicone first. As with all inputs, you want to make sure they're super well shaken, very well agitated, so that they're consistent and homogeneous. Silicone is super helpful with the plant's cell wall, ability to fight off pests and diseases, and just gives it a good vigor. And after the silicone, we add Flava by VPS, which has a high content of flavolic acid and other amino acids, boosters for the plants. They really seem to like it so far. And we'll probably be adding about 1.2 millis per gallon on this transplant sauce. Once your silicone and your Flava are super well mixed, we're gonna go ahead and add some kelp. You want to be careful not giving them kelp after week 3 of flower, which some people believe can lead to increased rates of hermaphrodism. Once you've added your kelp, we can go ahead and add some humic acid. You want to be careful measuring humic acid. It has different densities, so there can be some foam at the top. You don't want to take your true reading from the top of the foam. You want to find where the liquid actually sits. So give it time to settle before you take your reading on humic acid. Once you've added your kelp, your humic, we're going to add some molasses. So what Daniel's doing is he's going to make a pre-preparation of the molasses with water, whip it up into a homogeneous slurry, and then we're going to incorporate that into our sauce. So a whisk is a really helpful tool. Alrighty, so once we've added our molasses, everything's super well incorporated. We're going to add some fermented grain extract. This is a high quality source of CalMag that we really enjoy using. We're going to add a little bit to the plants, give them a boost in their calcium and magnesium. Awesome, very good. Danny, thanks a lot for the help. So once you're done with your liquids, we're going to move on to some more of the heavy powders we'll be adding. Once again, we're going to follow our slurry tech to add those into our organic sauce. So we're going to start with some mycorrhizal trichoderma inoculation. I like to use Great White. Been using it for a long time. Once it's homogenized and mixed in really thoroughly, there's no pockets on the bottom, we'll add it into our, what is now a solution. Now we've added another form, Michael Jordan, which has extremely high content of glomus, making a slurry. From there, we're going to continue on to our Root Shield wettable powder. We use the Root Shield Plus. Vessel with liquid and make a slurry. We have most of our inputs. There's one more we're going to add, and that is some organic rock dust. Constant agitation, OCD agitation between rows of plants. You want to come back and stir, stir, stir. And that is our sauce. Perfect for transplants, perfect for early veg, perfect for early flower. Thanks for the help making that, Danny. Let's get to the garden.
All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mike. If you haven't met me before, I am one of the technical crop advisors. Popped in was Will Batt and Jacob Gibbs, either direction, one of those. All right. So I'm a technical crop advisor at Growers House in CannaCribs and one of the staff agronomists there. Basically, we work to answer as much or provide as much knowledge as possible to our growers to provide them the success and the tools they need for success. Jacob obviously does that same thing for advanced nutrients specifically. We thought he'd be, a great addition to this panel because of his knowledge. Will, our TCA out in New Mexico, obviously one of the big dogs out there that knows how to run a fertigation and IPM program. So we wanted to have him on here to make sure we had a rounded experience because I like to look at things like ag. Will has a really deep knowledge of how to run it in cannabis, and Jacob has a really deep knowledge of how they produce and get their nutrients to the end customer. So first things first, Will, if you want to go and introduce yourself, please.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Good to be here today. Happy to be on the webinar. I'm coming from, running some small scale to mid scales to large scale facilities. And over the last little bit over a year, been working with the CannaCribs team and working with facilities out here in New Mexico and Missouri, getting people, optimized, helping build efficiencies, but also dial in fertigation programs, IPM programs, all of the little minutia that sometimes it's just helpful to have that second set of eyes looking over the shoulder and helping through the process. But happy to be here on the webinar chatting with y'all.
Hey guys, Jacob Gibbs here from Advanced Nutrients. Like Mike said, I have a similar background to Will, big, small, and everything in between from commercial side of production. And then now for the last couple of years, I've been doing field sales and facility advisement for Advanced Nutrients, which has brought me to a lot of grows all over the country. I get to work with a lot of cool people and help a lot of people along the way, helping people dial in their nutritional needs from, the macro scale all the way down to, helping somebody tweak minor deficiencies, things like that, using tissue sampling and stuff, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But doing a lot of hands-on stuff with cultivators throughout the country has been a really awesome time with Advanced Nutrients. And I'm excited to be here today.
Always a pleasure to be hanging out with you, Jacob, and thanks for being with us. All right, so before we kick off, I just wanted to preface, we really want to focus on the science of this nutrient delivery, and one of the other reasons why we brought you, Jacob, is you kind of understand the science of this nutrient delivery, regardless of your kind of brand's direction or your brand's recommendations. You know that there are base recommendations, but there's also just the basic data that you can follow to make those adjustments, like you said right now, like you said earlier. So why don't we go ahead and jump into the slides and then just, we'll just get into it and talk about these macros, micros, and basically what we need to cover in order to just get a good overview of how these plants are actually eating. So this is our intro page. Obviously, we've seen all of us here. So let's dive right into it. We got an hour and I don't want to waste any time. I want to get as much Q&A in as we can. So boom, the three macronutrients that we all know: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So we know nitrogen is good for we know the plant needs nitrogen for amino acids, basically every amino acid, all the enzymes, all those things. Phosphorus roots and shoots, potassium for ionic exchange. Do you guys have any specific recommendations, or like, do you guys have any like balance or ratios of NPK that you guys like to recommend, or like what is your general guidelines as far as NPK through a growing cycle?
Will,
Yeah, sure. I mean, so, as many growers typically will see, a lot of fertilizers more focused for vegetative growth are going to be a little bit higher in nitrogen, still with some potassium, and a little bit of phosphorus to make sure that we're not bottlenecked by our phosphorus. We'll also see in a lot of clone feeds and early transplant feeds a little bit higher phosphorus for a little bit more of that root development can be really crucial. As well as, even some people will go as far as to limit nitrogen in their mother stock to help promote rooting within those early cuts. And of course, as we start to transition into bloom, that's where we really start to boost that phosphorus, boost that potassium, to make sure that we're able to really pump as much nutrition as possible into the flower sites and the budding development.
Yeah, speaking about potassium, most blends have a pretty high amount of potassium. Can you kind of explain like what that does in a nutrient solution, Jacob, and like what that ionic potential like means for the plant?
Yeah, absolutely. So potassium's got a really big function in water movement. It's kind of a gatekeeper, right? So plants will, if anybody's familiar with the electrical conductivity gradient, essentially the stronger solution, nutrients will move to, or water will flow to the higher concentration of salts. So plants uptake a lot of nutrients really aggressively. And so when we're pumping in a lot of potassium, it allows the plant to actually flow that water in that concentrated gradient. It's a mobile nutrient as well, so it's translocatable within the plant. It plays a lot of big roles, works directly with the proteins and the guard cells in the plant as well. So it's just kind of a widely necessary nutrient.
Got it. Yeah, and definitely see it in high concentrations in most of our hydro blends that we have out there for our medicinal plants.
Exactly.
And then the secondaries that everyone loves to forget and then remember in a single bottle is your calcium and your magnesium. So yeah, the big thing about calcium and magnesium, in my opinion, that people don't understand a lot is the type of uptake, and we'll go over those uptake pathways. I'll probably on the next slide here, but yeah, calcium, super important. All of your basic like cell wall elongation, basically all of the membrane formation, like calcium plays a huge role in just basic growth. And then magnesium, of course, is that like backbone of chlorophyll, and then part of like a bunch of enzymatic processes and parts of the metabolism. So what's one like couple of things that you guys have seen like when you guys see like either calcium deficiencies or like when you see excesses?
I'll start it off. So from the calcium deficiency side, a lot of times we'll see this in cocoa grows is primarily one of the biggest constituents of the calcium deficiency. And a lot of times it's actually not a deficiency in the calcium, but an excess of potassium because they're antagonistic. So if you have too much potassium in your plant and not enough calcium, it'll start to overwhelm the natural movement of the calcium. And so you'll end up not uptaking as much calcium as the plant really needs. And it's a huge component of cell wall structure. Everybody focuses on silicon from the cell wall strengthening, but realistically that happens mostly from calcium.
Right. Silicon is the armor. Calcium is like the skin, like that's exactly. Building the skin. Yeah.
And that's where we're even starting to see a lot more, calcium being recommended within IPM regimes, really trying to bolster that plant's natural immunities, really strengthening those cell walls so that plant can really help fend off, pathogens as well as pests. Yeah.
And you brought up a good point about like, I said earlier, we had high K in a lot of these blends, and you're absolutely right. Sometimes when you have too much K, it locks that calcium out, or conversely, when you have too much calcium, it locks the K out. So it really is a balance. That watering through, resetting that root zone solution is so important. We try to harp on that a lot. And of course, the micronutrients, we cannot forget about the micronutrients. All of the micronutrients, we'll go over the individual ones on the next slide, but the biggest thing is like how they're delivered to the plant when we usually see them. Organic acids and chelation. Most of the time, we're going to see chelation, right? Like, Jacob, can you explain what chelation is, since you're from advanced and you're building this stuff out?
Yeah, for sure. So chelation is just a process of binding a metal or an inorganic compound to something that helps it mobilize within the plant, facilitating the uptake directly rather than allowing like organic acids, like you said, Mike, to function in a natural way. This is kind of the dividing factor between organics and synthetics as far as forced uptake and forced nutrient mobility versus allowing things to happen in a more natural way.
Yeah, and speaking of natural, Will, can you speak to that organic chelation? Because I know you've worked with a lot of living soil systems before.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where it's, oftentimes when we're delivering this mineral nutrition through our salt-based feeds, a lot of these micronutrients are already pre-chelated. So the plant is able to utilize these very, very easily. Whereas, in organic systems, oftentimes you have so much going on within that biology, within the root zone, that you have a lot of nutrients that are still locked up within that soil matrix. And so, building that root zone ecology, really trying to incorporate a lot more microbes that can break these down. The introduction of humics and fulvics can also play a part in chelating some of these nutrients for that plant to be able to uptake.
Right, because as those break down, they basically turn into chelating agents, and those metals bind in and get brought up. So, just real quick before we go on to the next slide here, pH and solution stability. Like, I know we didn't put it in the slide deck because I'm sure everyone has seen that infographic with a bunch of bars of each element, and then there's like that line that intersects right at 5.8 that everyone's seen, I'm sure. So we all know that like for this type of hydroponic growing, like around 5.8 to about 6 is good. But why does pH affect that availability, and like how can we make sure that we're always in that range?
Well, I mean, for starters, it's just a natural gradient for individual elements. It's just something that's been discovered along, the progression of plant science. But from a forced production perspective, indoor cultivation, controlled cultivation in general, we've recognized that either by manipulating pH or by stabilizing pH, we're able to drive certain uptake. And that's also, actually, I'm glad you mentioned it, another key component of the chelates that we see in a lot of these nutrients. Those specific chelates affect what's available at a certain pH range. Right. So it's kind of a hand-in-hand situation where you'll see a lot of growers maybe start out at like a 5.7, 5.8 range in veg, and then they'll slowly creep up into the low 6s in flower because of that specific gradient with the nutrient availability.
Yeah, and that's where you'll see even some cultivators that run a very similar nutrition program across the entire growth phase of their plant, but they're really focusing on pH to allow that plant to uptake specific nutrients at different points within the cycle.
Got it. Yeah, and I know like guys like to add like a lot of things like either magnesium sulfate or other sulfates towards the end of their flowering cycles too, to bring a little bit more acidity into that root zone. So yeah, that totally makes sense that you'd want to modulate that pH in order to get the maximum nutrients in those delivery regions that they're best delivered at. Right. So speaking of delivery of nutrients, let's go right into how these nutrients are getting into the plant through the roots. So I don't know, most people don't know me enough, I guess, to know that I'm not a big fan of foliar feeding. I think that you should be putting food in the mouth of the plant, which is at the roots. So these three main uptake avenues are things that I really want people to consider, and they should know, I feel, before they apply these nutrients. Because like I'll let you guys take direct and diffusion, but for mass flow, the calcium moves into the plant through the action of water uptake. So if you are having hard drybacks, it's obviously not going to be taking up calcium. It's also calcium is very much taken in the newer growth of the roots. So during transplant shock, you're going to have a decrease of calcium uptake, little things like that. So knowing that, like, okay, my calcium, my nitrates, my sulfur, that's moving in mass flow. So I got to make sure that whenever I have irrigation events, that's really important to have balanced numbers of those nutrients. Everything else, like the direct action and diffusion, I know that it's not going to be directly when I water that the plant takes it up, but the plant's going to take it up when it needs it. So there's other considerations. So yeah, if you guys want to take direct or active uptake and diffusion.
Yeah, so for diffusion, that's where we're really seeing the movement of nutrients to the root surface in response to a concentration gradient. So if we have high concentration of things like phosphorus, potassium, zinc within the root zone, they're going to move along that gradient and into the plant. And that's where, starting to build up that, the concentration within your media can really help push the uptake of these macro and micronutrients into the plant.
Yeah, and on the other side of the coin, direct and active uptake. This is the area where root intercept falls into play. This is direct contact. So this is more on the organic side of things. A lot of times where you've got a symbiotic relationship between your beneficial bacteria and microbes, creating that transport, munching down on some of the phosphorus, allowing it to be uptaken. And this is definitely something that, we don't necessarily rely on from a synthetic nutrient perspective. But like I said, on the flip side of it, for organics, it is huge. It's imperative because the soil is what's feeding the plant, not the nutrients that you're putting into the soil. So not as much of an issue for growers that are maybe running sterile, as we like to say, using hypochlorous and ORP products to raise the oxygen level in the root zone. They're not relying on microbial inoculants in order to do that, but
as much, yeah.
For our organic farmers out there, it's crucial.
Right.
Yeah, and it's really allowing the plant to feed itself. You're acting as the soil farmer.
Yes,
right.
Sir.
Yeah, and that's kind of that. Also, the direct active uptake. It has a lot to do with like the type of media you choose too, right? Because like cocoa coir is just gonna, like if you're using fine coir, it's gonna have so much surface area in that pot versus a rockwool cube of the same volume. It's not going to have as much actual surface area because of the structure of the cube, So like, yeah, you really have to kind of plan your nutrient delivery, I feel, not only on what you want to deliver, but what the plant's sitting in and how it's going to direct actively uptake stuff.
Absolutely. And the growing medium plays a huge role in how you feed. It changes your irrigation strategy, the volume of your nutrients in your irrigation system, everything. It's important to not water rockwool like you're watering soil and vice versa.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or then even buffered cocoa versus non-buffered cocoa. It's,
people got opinions on that. And I think we're going to get into that on the next slide here. And I think that's an important point for a lot of people to consider. One thing that we always hear is like which nutrients can move and which nutrients can't move throughout the plants. We have, obviously right here, it's just written down for people to read, but like, I guess the most important thing for people to consider is like how to know whether something is immobile or not immobile and what that deficiency is. So like, how would someone be able to tell if it's an immobile or an immobile nutrient deficiency or lockout?
Yeah, typically if it's a mobile nutrient, the plant is able to relocate those nutrients from its oldest growth to its newest growth, because that plant is always trying to direct its energy to the new growth. And that's where something like nitrogen deficiency, typically we're going to see with yellowing on the lowest leaves, because that plant is basically utilizing that nitrogen from those lowest leaves and translocating it up into the new growth. Whereas if we see something like iron or calcium, that's going to be, we're going to be seeing those deficiencies within that new growth. Because that plant cannot translocate from the oldest growth.
Right.
Yeah. Same thing with sulfur too, right? We were actually talking about this the other day. I've seen growers report back on transition plants yellowing in their new shoots, but they don't. They think it's nitrogen, and they're misidentifying that deficiency. So it's very important to understand where the deficiency is being identified, and new shoots are going to give you a immobile nutrient deficiency cue, whereas old growth is always going to be mobile nutrients.
Right. And, a lot of the times I'll ask for certain weird criteria, like if they're getting hollow stems or if the stems are, a certain color, and that usually can indicate whether or not that plant's trying to pull from it. Like when your petioles start to turn purple, they're starting to get some phosphorus pulled out of them, things like that. So I know we're going to go to the next slide real quick. I just wanted to touch on the balance of nutrient. Like, we should always emphasize like the plant will take up what it needs, except for like the mass flow ions that kind of move in through the action of water. So it's more about having a balance in the root zone, I would imagine, than just trying to deliver. Plant needs calcium, hit it with calcium. You should just keep delivering a balanced nutrition and let the plant balance out its uptake, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people love to throw more. And sometimes it's, like I said earlier, too much potassium can lock out calcium. The same thing can be said for a lot of ingredients in our nutrient mixes. Too much of a good thing is definitely not always a good thing. So balance is critical. If you just start pumping your plant full of stuff or running it all into your media, that doesn't mean the plant's taking it up. So maybe taking a step back and figuring out the source of the problem rather than identifying and putting a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, and that can also just lead to, for one, it's just a waste of nutrients, which is a huge issue in agriculture in general. But on top of that, that's where we are causing some of these imbalances. But it just brings us back to the need for actual tissue testing, actually giving yourself proper data as to what your plant is uptaking. Also doing leachate testing, see what's left in the media, see what's left, within that leachate, to see what the plant's not uptaking and what maybe we can back off of, because less is definitely more.
That's true. Like a lot of people don't really consider that by doing tissue testing, it allows you to just continually back off your nutrients until you find those points of deficiencies, and then just stack a little bit above then. And you've literally made the most efficient nutrient program.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, Mike, I know that you've saved some facilities a lot of money just in doing that nutrient testing and saying, hey, we can back off on a lot of these nutrients and still have, the same yields and the same product.
I mean, I come from conventional ag, and those guys know, like, hey, I'm going to buy like $2,000 worth of nitrogen this year. Like they're down to the molecules of like what they're buying in order to make the numbers work. Because farms, the margins are tight for those crops. So ion interactions in the soil. I know like all of this nutrient uptake stuff is important, but it really comes down to what the plant is in also. So like we have a bag of Mother Earth cocoa that we all love. Cocoa, Rockwool, it really just comes down to like CEC capacity, water holding capacity. Do you guys have any like big considerations when it comes to media selection and how that plays into nutrient uptake?
Well,
yeah, I mean, I think we could all talk about this for quite a bit of time, but absolutely. I mean, so that's where, looking at the type of media that we're trying to grow with, we talked a little bit about, buffered versus unbuffered cocoa. So cocoa coir has a pretty high cation exchange capacity. So it has a negative charge that will bind to those cations, things like calcium and magnesium. So if we're using an unbuffered cocoa, which means that all of those negative charged particles are open, they're ready to receive those cations once we flush a solution through that media. A lot of people will, take that unbuffered cocoa, they'll hit it with, just a CalMag and call it good and then, use their feed. But typically, I really prefer using like an unbuffered cocoa, just especially these compressed bricks that just save on so much labor, and charging those with your initial feed. Charging that with the feed and then watering back in with the feed. Typically you'll fill up those negatively charged sites while still having your full feed profile, rather than just having, maybe some nitrogen, calcium, and magnesium.
And when you mean first feed, sorry to interrupt, but when you mean first feed, do you mean like if you're doing a flowering cycle, like week 1 or something like that?
Sure. Yeah.
Got it.
And something like Rockwool is so inert with such a low cation exchange capacity that we're able to pretty much hit that with our feed right off the go. We don't need to worry about that media effectively stealing some of our cations.
Got it.
And that's where we also still see a lot of people using buffered cocoa, which is an easy solution. And that's where also, I'm sure Jacob can talk about this a little bit, but you'll see some nutrient lines that are a little bit more focused for cocoa coir or for higher CEC medias.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you guys have all seen cocoa versions of nutrients out there. We've got the Sensi cocoa and the Connoisseur cocoa. Other brands have, media specific nutrients. I know even some companies out there have a version for medialess for just water, DWC and bucket systems and aeroponics and all that jazz, flood and drain guys. Those are all engineered specifically for that balance of the cation exchange. Cocoa is probably my favorite medium because it gives you kind of the best of both worlds. And as Will mentioned, that anion and cation exchange, the plant is a natural hydrogen pump, pumping out those positively charged ions and producing or inputting enough negatively charged cations into the system allows the plant to work that out in the root zone. So it's very important that, we're taking that into consideration in our nutrient recipes for, when we're working with some of these commercial cultivators. They have different growing styles, everything becomes very bespoke. But as far as the buffering, I can double down on, Will's testament about broadening compressed unbuffered media. It's my go-to choice for large scale operations, because if I can float out 500 3-gallon pots, soak them or stick them and come back a few hours later and start transplant, I haven't had to have anybody hand water those in. They're ready to go. Then we go back in and hand water your veg feed back on top of your transplant, because that crucial contact moment between new roots and new media is imperative that you're not damaging those root cilia, those fine white hairs, because all that time you spent building that good root structure in your propagation stage can be set back a few days just by mishandling your clones during transplant, or going into unpre-buffered or pre-soaked media. Yeah. And if we're using unbuffered solutions, going in with your veg feed, that's when you can inoculate with your mycorrhizal products, and those are really good practices to be able to ensure a healthy transition into your veg stock.
And that's where those that are still filling, plastic pots, fabric pots, whatever, with cocoa, soil, I do see a lot of people that are transplanting into a dry media and then watering in. And that's something that we actually touched on the other day, that, really need to make sure that we pre-saturate that media before planting. So as Jacob was saying, that we are able to preserve those delicate root hairs and that those don't immediately dry out upon planting in the media.
Right. And you want those roots to basically hit in an environment that they're used to. Yep. If they're hitting this inert environment, they're going to be searching and wasting energy and root pruning themselves. Absolutely.
We've all bashed around some clones before, and we see them take a little bit more time to bounce back. And, the goal is to limit the amount of stress as best we can upon that transplant.
Exactly. We are growing a plant in a very stressful environment, and so limiting the amount of stress that we put on it when it's not desired is something we're trying to avoid at all times.
Got it. And then one last point here that I wanted to touch on was the watering. A lot of people, they don't consider the runoff. They don't consider their dry back in their media. EC is a function of water and mineral nutrition. It's electrical conductivity. So half of that equation is water. So when you don't have adequate water, your EC will spike. When you don't have dry backs, then you never accumulate enough EC a lot of the time to be in a healthy range for a lot of plant growth. So what's some of the things that you guys typically recommend when it comes to runoff as the last thing for this slide?
I mean, right off the bat, it's based on the irrigation strategy, and we could get into this with a whole different 1 hour, maybe 3-4 hour segment about irrigation strategy. But just like what we said about treating your media specifically the way it needs to be treated from a nutrient uptake perspective, the same thing from your runoff perspective. Rock wool is a great moisture holding capacity, so you got to be mindful of that. But as the plants get bigger in that small block, they're going to dry out faster. So you're going to have to monitor that dry back, make sure your EC is not climbing every time you water, unless that's the desired result, right? But typically speaking, in cocoa or in rock wool, you're looking for a standard percentage of runoff. And whether you're achieving that through multiple shots throughout the morning or, large bulk feedings in like a vegetative steer, the same thing can be done in cocoa and technically in soil. I feel like soil growers will typically water to saturation, maybe a little bit of runoff, and that'll affect the EC input of their feed planning as well. But with the cocoa and the rock wool, I definitely would say it varies on your irrigation strategy, but a good rule of thumb is 20%.
Yeah. And, one thing that I'd like to touch on is that I feel like, the big buzzword in the industry right now is crop steering. And you have a lot of cultivators that, everybody wants to crop steer. And what it really comes down to is crop steering, that's dialing in the last 10% of your cultivation. And it's I work with a lot of new cultivators that are, trialing out different things, trying to dial in their environment, dial in their feed cycle, and immediately they're crop steering. And they're not achieving proper runoff within, that steering, and they're starting to stack their media up to 10. I've even seen up to 18 EC, and that's where we run into some huge issues. So typically, I'll say it's let's focus on the main points within your cultivation, and then let's build our way up to crop steering. And that's where sometimes for people starting out, it can just be a little bit easier to have maybe 1, 2, 3 feed events in the morning just to achieve runoff, and then check that dry back. But that's where, once again, it's making sure that you're doing leachate tests, making sure that you have data to see how your irrigation strategy is working, and managing that EC and pH within the root zone.
Yeah, checking your runoff once a week is super easy, just as a nice little baseline of, okay, am I where I want to be? And most people don't think about that. And it's just a great, easy way to make sure you're not getting, a runaway train situation.
Right. Right. And speaking of analytics, so this is a client that I've worked with where he had certain micronutrient deficiencies. And, one thing that we try to do, obviously, at this point in this industry's evolution is be as efficient on fertilizers as possible. And, Advanced, you guys are making custom blends because of that reason. We're advising on custom solutions within blends because of that. So like this particular client of ours was growing white Cheeto, and he had these micronutrient deficiencies. And, instead of just increasing the rate of his base, what we did was we went in and we just added a little bit of DTPA iron, a little bit of EDTA copper and zinc. And, slowly but surely these types of issues kind of resolved themselves, which allowed us to change other parameters and get rid of other either excesses or deficiencies too. And, I think this is going to be a big part of the future of nutrient delivery, where you find a good base and you just kind of tweak it after you do these analytical tests, just to make sure that you're not pivoting all the time and you're just like making something work about 80% of the way. Like you said, Will, and then you have these little tools that give you the last 10 to 20% to really dial it in, but you want to be dialing it in, not just like pivoting to something new and trying it. I think these types of tools are going to be in one of the biggest improvements in growing for cannabis in the next coming years.
100%. And that's where also, as we try to cultivate to our absolute finest and really dial in our systems per cultivar, as we know, so many different cultivars feed differently.
Yeah.
Certain ones will, need a lot more nitrogen. Other ones might need a lot more potassium. And that's where doing these tests per cultivar can allow us to really have a little bit more of, dedicated feed strategies for each of, the cultivars that we're growing.
Absolutely. And, people talk a lot about, not being able to feed independent cultivars, things like that. And if you're really looking to dial in your building, we talk a lot in this industry about, this year, next year, whatever, but nobody ever looks long-term. We don't have a very long-winded mindset in this industry, as of late anyway. Everything's very short-term, very fast, and dialing in a facility can also mean dialing in your production planning, batching cultivars together that eat and drink similarly, that grow similarly morphologically. You don't want to group a really tall, stretchy sativa-esque plant with something like a true Durban that's short and squatty and doesn't like water.
Right.
And
that's what I think that's why these analytics over time are so important, because then you can just see give me all the strains that were low on phosphorus, and that will be the room that gets the base formula and a PK boost. Exactly. Give me all the strains where the nitrogen was too high, and that's going to be the strain where we dial back the nitrogen hard and early. So at that point, then you're being more and more efficient on your nutrients, because you're only delivering to the plants that need it, and you're not delivering things that the plants don't need. And then you can really know that your nutrient ROI is done, and then you can work on the labor and all the other parts of it. And all right, so I do want to get to that Q&A, man. I think people are going to have some good questions on this, right? So let's see here. Is Marco going to rejoin us, or am I diving right into the Q&A?
Come on back, Marco.
Hey,
he's here. All right.
Hey, guys. Sure, yeah. Thank you. That was great presentation and incredibly knowledgeable. So, let's see. We have a couple of questions here. See, starting.
The first one's a good one. Do sativas and indicas prefer a different nutrient schedule and ratio? I would say yes. The nutrient uptake is a lot of it plays a lot into the environmental aspect of the plant's growth. And if the environments are clearly different that they need, like a warm sativa versus a cool and drier, or a cool and wetter indica, then yeah, I would say your nutrient delivery might be different. But nowadays, with all the crosses, What do you guys think? Like, it's
It's
more
hard to call
applicable.
something a sativa versus an indica. There's so much crossover. I
Yeah.
mean, there's sativa leaning and indica leaning, and there can be some inferences made from that, but it's really hard to say in this point of so much inbreeding.
Yeah, and where I land with it is truly the growth length of the plant. You know, how long is it taking for this plant to flower? How fast is it vegging? That kind of thing. And I kind of lean on microgreens for a cue from that, because microgreens have to chew up all their micronutrients in 7 days in order to have a full nutritionally packed a snack for somebody, or, you know, a supplement. Same thing with shorter season plants. They need to get their nutrients faster. So it could be, you know, again, you can't make these assumptions without doing nutritional analysis to see if you're going overboard or not hitting those benchmarks. But yeah, from a theoretical perspective, if you were talking about the difference between how sativas and indicas feed, or shorter season plants versus longer season plants, yeah, I would say there's probably a difference there, but I don't have the analytical data to prove it.
Cool. And then looks like Ed Zubko is asking about contaminants and metals in worm casting and seaweed products. Apparently, he's inquired with a couple different manufacturers. Do you guys have any thoughts about these contaminants? And, you know, are they transferred into the cannabis plant, which ultimately then goes into the cannabis user? Or what do you guys know about that?
Well, I mean, metals can be a tricky thing. Cannabis can accumulate quite a bit of metals into
Very
its
good
tissue, and that's
biofuel.
where, you know, we really do need to be careful about the inputs that we are putting into our plant, and especially the, you know, how much we're applying these products. Mike, I know you have a few things to say specifically about seaweed.
Sourcing is so key. You know, I told this to Mr. Growen on his podcast, but like, if you're growing organic, you need to know exactly where the source material of all of your inputs comes from and how consistent that source is. Is this a company that gets this seaweed from the same Norwegian farm every time? Or in Q3 of last year, they were hurting for money and they went and bought Chinese seaweed? You know, like, you got to be careful on where they're sourcing things in the worm castings, you know, like organic inputs, like forest materials, a lot of the times have like organic arsenic just in them. So you have to find a threshold of tolerance. If it's for like state metric wheat or state metric medicinal plants, maybe you don't want to use those types of inputs. If it's more for like a caregiver, a home grower, a lot of the times, you know, that arsenic level isn't really that dangerous, or there isn't enough studies to show that it's dangerous, but, you know, it doesn't pass muster for the state. So you just kind of have to pick and choose which battles you want to fight versus how easily and consistently you can get those organic inputs.
Yeah, and I have a couple points on that as well. You know, from a manufacturer standpoint, like you mentioned, the batch consistency of sourcing, you know, this really important on, you know, the manufacturer that you go with for the supply of your component, whether it's the kelp or this, you know, or some other organic input. A lot of these things are farmed in regions of the world that don't have an EPA. And so that's why it's super important. You might be buying a bat guano from a tropical region that's right down the beach from some guy ripping out radiators out of boats and just polluting the water there. Same thing with like cocoa. It's very important that, you know, you mind where you're getting your cocoa, but same thing from, you know, the uptake side of things. You know, we can use these products carefully, and sourcing clean input materials can allow you to use these products confidently. I know that's one thing Advanced Nutrients makes a big claim on with our organics is the limited heavy metal content. But, you know, we also see that the metals in general are something that are a part of the elemental composition of a necessary nutrient profile. So it's, like you said, Will, a fine line.
Yeah. And, you know, a big thing that I see specifically out here in New Mexico, where there's a lot of soil growers, a lot of soil producers out here, is, you know, sourcing that soil. If we're running an actual living soil system, you know, we're making one purchase of soil, and that's the soil that stays with us for, you know, hopefully years, if we treat it well. And that's where I see a lot of people that, you know, they go for the lowest bidder. They go for the cheapest option. They don't do their research. And typically what I'm telling people is, if we're making that one big investment, you know, let's trial 4 or 5 different manufacturers. Let's try several different brands. Let's get our own tests on them. You know, we can always ask for tests from these companies, but let's ask for a sample from each of these 4 producers, run our own tests so that we can know exactly what we're putting into our system. And can make sure that we're producing the best medicine for our consumers.
And that brings up a great point about testing. That's one thing I feel like a lot of, now that we're talking organics at scale, a lot of people are starting to do more living soil indoors, not just in greenhouses or outside. And it's on, the responsibility falls on the end user to ensure that whatever material they're buying from an organic manufacturer, especially when it comes to soil, they're not required to submit manufacturer's analyses like we are with liquid and nutrients.
Three letters. People need to ask their organic input people for 3 main letters, COAs. Give me your certificates of analysis. Let me know that this is heavy metal free, bro. Like, that's what we want.
Yeah.
But even at that, as you guys are saying, you know, batch from batch, you know, there can be variation. So
if they are switching vendors, they should be giving you new COAs on every new lot. Things like that.
Yeah. Do a little research.
Yep.
Cool. And the next one is a great question by Stevie Rennie, I believe is how you pronounce his name. I've mentioned this before. I own a small avocado farm here in North County, San Diego, and I've actually dealt with root rot. I've dealt with a lot of issues that happen when you don't allow your trees, and in our case, plants here for this conversation, to dry back. I know you guys mentioned dry back earlier in the conversation, and Stevie asks, what is dryback? So go ahead, guys.
I mean, point blank period. It's just the time between waterings. How long are you going between watering? And is your media either effectively running off or drying out? Plain and simple.
And what, I guess, what's the benefit of the dryback then, the period?
You use it as like a metric almost. So like you hear like water holding capacity in medias a lot. So like this cocoa, this 1 gallon cocoa has a 60% water holding capacity. So at its like normal baseline saturation, it'll kind of drain down and have like a 60% water content in that block before it starts to dry off even more. Like that's the most stable amount of water in that block. So when it comes to dryback, I like to look at it as percentages because it helps us kind of control irrigation. So once that cube is at anything less than 60, maybe like 50 to 45, that's when you can know, like, okay, there's probably less water pushing into the plant. There's less opportunity for transpiration, maybe hit it with another watering event. Or if you're trying to steer the plant and you want to get like a hard EC moment in the root zone so that it stops putting on biomass or something, that's when you can allow the root zone to dry back as well. Dry back is a really good way to kind of, I hate to say it, but steer the plant, drive the plant into more growth, because as it dries, it certain metabolic processes say like, okay, let's slow things down. And once it gets water again and it can push out more roots again, then it can be like, oh, okay, I can push out more roots, I'll push out more top. And then it just goes back and forth. So dry back is this important thing. It's like almost like the exhale for the plant, if that makes any sense, where it needs a little bit of time in between watering so that it can kind of reset, kind of reassess like the next batch of watering that it's going to take.
Yeah, and also, Marco, you brought up like root rot and pathogens. You know, if we're just constantly cultivating in a saturated media, that's where we can really see a lot of issues like Pythium, Fusarium pop up. Also, you know, everybody's got a few pesky fungus gnats, and it's when we're not able to hit those, we're not able to dry that media out a little bit each day, that those fungus gnats can get really out of control, and that's when they can start getting up into the buds. But you know, with drybacks, it's that fine line. It's making sure that, you know, there's many cultivators that are able to lower their nutrient usage because they're utilizing drybacks to stack that EC of the media higher, and so they're driving the nutrition of that plant by concentrating the salts within that media through those drybacks. But you know, if we're drying back too hard, that's where we can stack that media a little bit too high, and that's where we can see lockout. So it's all about, you know, finding that balance, making sure that you're doing the proper tests to make sure that it's you're not drying back too hard and you are achieving the goals that you're shooting for.
Right. Yeah, that runoff testing is super key. It's like if you're
Absolutely.
putting down 2 and your runoff is like 2, like something's going on. Like you can feed more, man. Like it's really eating. Yeah.
Super easy. It's like even just take your table runoff once a week and test that. You know, it's not going to be the most accurate, but it's a really easy way for your fertigation team to, you know, just get data within the field.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. That's a nice segue into the next question by Mark. Looks like you pronounce it Harnashar. I think it was a question that actually came in this morning prior to the webinar. and I forwarded it to you guys, but I think it'd be a huge help for the folks watching today to learn a little bit more about as far as fertigation systems and it seems to be the ideal environment to harbor bacteria and introduce disease into the plants. So Mark was asking about a type of microbes and good bacteria that can deliver needed nutrients to his root zone. Besides lower fertigation tank temperatures, along with tank aeration, how do I keep beneficial microbes and good bacteria at the root zone while maintaining the healthy fertigation system?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go ahead and start it off. There's a lot of things going on here. You know, if you're implementing something that's a living biology into your batching system, you're kind of playing with a little bit of fire here. You know, you could potentially set yourself up some anaerobic conditions. So while you might be able to get away with it, what I typically will recommend for people that want to run things through their batching system is put it in at the last day of the week, follow up with some clean water to clean out the system, and then make sure you're staying up on your system maintenance. This was something else I touched on with Mark earlier, was doing line cleaning, whether it's biweekly, between batches, whatever. Anything is better than nothing. And if you're including carbon inputs into your system, it's almost requirement if you want to have long-term success without clogging emitters, having, you know, diseases breed inside your lines and then get into your plants. You start having plants drop in the middle of your canopy, you know, that kind of stuff. And you know, if you are going to run biology, the easiest way to keep your fertigation system clean, point blank period, is to not run it through it and just to top drench all your biology on top of your plants.
I would have teams basically hand water in once a week or once every other week biologicals into the root zone, just so that we bypassed our fertigation system. Now, as Jacob was saying, you know, it can be done. There are things that you can put in place. The main thing being, you know, make sure that it doesn't sit in your batch tank for too long, that you properly clean that batch tank afterwards, and that you run clean water through those lines afterwards so that you don't have any of those biologicals sitting in your lines and sitting in the system building biofilms. The other thing is that, you know, there's a lot of people that love to agitate those batch tanks, or love to aerate those batch tanks. A little bit of agitation can be good, but we don't necessarily want to add, you know, tons of air within that batching system, as that, once again, can create room for a lot more biofilms to build up. And the last piece is, you know, it's always so important when we are flipping that room, which is why I typically stress, you know, not to separate rooms into multiple harvest zones if we can, is to do hard line cleans and hard line resets each cycle, running a high acid cleaner to build up any scale or buildup, mineral buildup within the lines, and then something like Sanidate, periacetic acid afterwards to properly sanitize those lines. You know, at the very least, every room reset.
And I'm lazy too. I like to use a dry product and just put it underneath the transplant before I transplant and call it good. That's how I would do it too.
Yeah. And that's a really common practice for most cultivators out here. I mean, there's a lot of granular products on the market that people will just incorporate into the soil or to go right around the transplant. There's also some powdered products that you're supposed to dust on direct contact. There's a lot of, you know, and honestly, with microbes, it's kind of the more the merrier, right? Like, you hit them with some dry powder with your transplant, you go back and re-inoculate later, especially if you're applying pesticides that are going to end up either getting sprenched onto your root zone or just drip down into the root zone in general. It's a really good idea to maintain your microbes throughout your growth phase and your flowering phase even, because certain beneficial bacteria and fungi can actually help uptake of phosphorus and other important nutrients. So it's not like they don't play a role.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I see a question that directly asks that, so let's just answer that now. Like, those inoculants, like, the whole point of them is certain bacterial cultures will help fixate nitrogen, certain bacterial cultures will help fixate phosphorus. They all play within a normal web of ecology in a root zone. Mycorrhizae, once that colonizes your roots, because it only works if it colonizes your roots. Once that colonizes your roots, it basically becomes an extension of the roots, giving you more water holding and water gathering capacity, gives you more nutrient processing capacity, because the rhizosphere or that mycorrhiza will process nutrients differently than the plant, but they'll exchange nutrients within each other. So yeah, it's really important, especially in a soil system where you don't have chelated nutrients going in there, to have those high biology systems to make sure that chelation happens naturally.
Yeah, and even within hydroponic systems, I mean, the importance of biology. We're still only kind of cracking the surface of what some of these beneficials can do for our plants. But one other big thing is stimulating an innate immune response.
Mm-hmm.
Having that biology within the root zone has the plant already kind of bolstering itself for other infections that are to come.
And there's white paper research showing the efficacy of certain species, either as a preventative for different rhizobacterium and different Pythium fusarium, a lot of the common root-borne infections. Not to say that any of these products will absolutely be a 100% safeguard, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Doing a little bit up front is going to make sure that you're giving your best foot forward, and at least make it's like running a deep water culture facility and not having water chillers. You're almost guaranteeing you're going to end up with Pythium. So keep your systems clean, inoculate often. There's a lot going on there for sure.
Cool. We've only got a couple minutes left. Let me get. It looks like there's two quick questions about cocoa. Again, it's a follow-up. Looks like from Mark. Growing in cocoa, how much higher should runoff ECB versus EC at the irrigation tank? And then the second question about cocoa is how much dryback is recommended for cocoa? That's by Black Rose Cultivator. So maybe you guys can give us a quick 2-minute answer for those, and then we'll get to the last two questions.
Sweet. So with cocoa, I typically recommend 20 to 30% runoff as like a standard rule of thumb. As far as the dryback portion of it, it really depends on the stage of morphology the plant's in flower. If you're in a vegetative state in veg, you want to run a higher moisture content and lesser drybacks. If you're in a bulking stage and you want to actually push flower production, you're going to want lower water content, higher EC, and more frequent irrigations. Or maybe just if you're doing single waterings during the day, you might dry back a little further to help stack that EC. But it is a complex answer for sure.
Jacob, how high do you typically like to go with runoff? Let's say like in the bulking phase in flower.
If you're building it up, you can see runoff 3-4 higher than your input. I'd say it's a calculated risk, right? You're intentionally climbing your EC, knowing at some point you have to push that leachate through the system. So it's a little variable based on growing medium and growing environment, lighting, CO2, all the other symbiotic characters that play there. But going up into like the 7s and 8s, maybe creeping up close to 10. I've definitely seen some in the higher ranges. But again, this is a really delicate balance. And if you're not in full control, you can cause yourself some really big problems when you come out of week 6 with buds that look like my thumb.
Yeah, and that's where like I've even seen some cultivations where it's like, there may be only 2 EC above their starting feed, but they're not running CO2. And so that plant is not able to utilize all of those nutrients, and it's already showing signs of lockout. So it's all part of the greater picture of making sure that all of your environmentals are dialed for that plant to be able to utilize that high amount of salts within the media.
And I'd say if your environment is that good, generally the range is like from the tank, I'd expect like an EC of like 1.5 all the way up to maybe like a 2.8 or like a 3 on delivery. And then your root zone should be reading on a leachate test, like a pour over test. I would expect numbers around like the 3 or 4 all the way up to about 6 or 7, depending on the stage of plant. So as long as your runoff, I think, is within that window. In cocoa, rockwool, you can do some weird stuff. But in cocoa, since it's more like a soil, I would apply probably a 1.5 all the way up to a 3. And then I would expect to receive in runoff like a 2.5 all the way up to like a 7. Once it gets out of that range, it's too high. Then it's like, all right, let's add a little bit more water to the actual feed, dilute it down. Once it gets too low, I'd be like, all right, I need to feed a little bit more. But in the meantime, I'd want to also do a leachate analysis to see what is low, what is high. Because if I'm just like 0 on phosphorus leaching out, it's just like, all right, that's a bottleneck. I need to add more phosphorus. Or, dude, this is like a liquid K solution. I need to stop adding so much potassium and things like that. Yeah.
Cool. And it looks like, so we've got 2 more questions. One is about dryback again, which I think we've answered pretty well in depth.
On the dryback also, I would just say like, okay, if you're you don't want to ever get past like 45% water holding capacity. So just know, like when you're, whatever media you're using, once you're past about a 45% water holding capacity, usually your rate of transpiration starts to slow down. And anything below that, the plant's really not taking up water or nutrients. It's just trying to survive at that point. So generally, you don't want to go beyond or under, I would say 45%. And generally, you don't want to stay above 60% for more than basically your day period. You don't want to be at 60% or higher water holding capacity for 20 hours. That's going to be gross and make weird things happen. So yeah, generally, I would say you want good dry back in the evenings. You want over 60% water holding capacity that drains out during the day as a plant uses water. And then you're maintaining at least 45% so that the plant doesn't freak out and stop taking up water.
Great. And looks like, thanks, Mike. Mikey Gersh, who I believe is calling in from Germany. He is asking about Proline, and I think that would be something, is that maybe directed towards Jacob, right? Or is that, no, what is that Proline Advanced?
Which Proline?
Yeah, which one? Yeah, we got a couple.
Oh, I know. Okay. Yeah, I don't know which one, but I guess how's the new Proline running with minimal secondary additives? I don't know, maybe any.
So yeah, just jump right in for sake.
Oh, that's a cultivator series, right?
The cultivator series is the new one that we launched. But even with the Sensi Professional series, you can run almost any base nutrient out there to success if that is your bottleneck. If you're forced to keep your inputs minimal, you can modify and run those base nutrients to success by stacking the media, by running a bit more of an aggressive irrigation strategy, but also just all, no frills. If that's your program, if that's your desire, you just have to make sure that your plants are getting everything that they're needing. So if you're not doing tissue analysis and all that jazz, then at the very least, monitoring your runoff, monitoring your EC in the media, doing a little bit of data collection to make sure that you're driving the plant in the direction that it wants to go.
Yeah. It's like Will said, it's like that last 10%, because it's like you can add additives all day, but is your base nutrient program good? If that's not good, like additives, they're just stopgap measures. You got to get that nutrient program solid and then consider adding additives.
Yeah, strong foundation first, for sure.
Cool. And it looks like Mikey's actually calling from California, not Germany, and he was talking about the Sensi line. So, well, great. I think that's it for our Q&A session. It looks like we're right about time, so that kind of worked out perfect. So yeah, thank you guys so much. This was incredibly informative and educational. Thank you everybody for joining us. Do you guys want to kind of give any last minute shout outs or any announcements, Mike, Will, or Jacob?
Matt Buciello, the
EC
EC at Harvest. Basically, whatever you're doing at 7 and 8 should just taper off, and at Harvest, what I like to do is do about a 2.0 EC solution of of my normal formula at 1.0, and then I'll add 1.0 EC of magnesium sulfate. Because magnesium is shown, if you displace a lot of the ions within the plant with magnesium, you can get a better, whiter ash, which everyone likes.
Cool. And I've been getting a couple questions. Jerry just asked where they can watch this again. It's a good question. YouTube. A lot of amazing information that these guys have been sharing. This is like so much knowledge. It's amazing. So I'll be sending an email out to everybody who was part of this webinar with a link to the CannaCribs Research and Development channel. That is kind of a newer channel that we're working on YouTube. So there'll be a link in there to rewatch this. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Again, just to kind of circle back, you know what? I never even did this. Let me do this really quick. We do have a 10% discount available on growershouse.com, 10% off site-wide using code WEB10. That's good through the end of the month. And Advanced Nutrients is also going to be providing a really nice little discount for some items on our website coming up. We're going to send that included in the email that we're sending. Yep. And so, yeah, Web 10 again for now. Anything on Growers House that's not considered killer priced items, go ahead and use that to go ahead and get a nice little discount on your next purchase. What else, guys?
Be on the lookout for Cultivator Series. It's our new 3-part powder in the Pro line that we're offering. Competitive pricing, excellent performance. everything in the alpha and beta phase testing that we did over the winter and into the spring was phenomenal. We've been seeing nothing but great results, and I know you guys are going to be happy with it.
Perfect.
Yeah, and on the CannaCribs side, if you guys are watching and you guys want to get into tissue testing, you guys want more information, please reach out to us. If you have a small cultivation to, if you're a large cultivator that's licensed, just let us know. At the very least, we'd like to take a look at what you're delivering and then offer you some testing so that you can be assured that, you're hitting, like we said, you got to get the base nutrition right. Once that's good, then you can experiment and make the formula your own. But we want to make sure that people are really getting the fundamentals of nutrient delivery down first before we make things our own. So yeah, let us know if you have any questions.
And also to follow up on that, even questions beyond nutrient delivery. Mike and I are here to pretty much, be of assistance to all of your commercial facilities. So, if you have a question, well outside, if you're dealing with a russet mite issue, give us a call. That's what we're here for, is to help you guys, create solutions to solve issues within your garden.
And if they wanted to email you guys, it looks like it's just will@growershouse.com.
Sure.
Or mike@growershouse.com. And then Jacob.
I've got the long one. It's my name, jacob.gibbs@advancednutrients.com. So feel free to hit me up with any cultivation related questions as well.
Yeah. Also,
Perfect.
if you fill out the CannaCribs Consulting type form on our Growers House site, Mike or I or Joe will reach out to you and we'll have a chat.
Great. Yeah. And then to remind everybody, we are going to do these webinars monthly. We'll have another one coming up probably middle of October. It'll be most likely Mike and myself, and then who else is available. That's kind of a specific to the discipline that we're going to be covering. Not exactly sure what the topic is yet, but we've got a lot of fun stuff that Mike and I have been working on as far as promos and getting some really good ideas out there. So I think that's going to be it, guys. I'm going to push the end webinar button, and we'll see everybody on the next one. And thank you all. Looks like 68 people stayed on this whole time. Which is amazing. So thank you guys for the education. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Cheers,
Have a good
guys.
one. Keep
All
growing.
right, bye guys.
Thanks, y'all.